Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 6, Lesson 7, Player Ship Modifiers. In this lesson, we're going to create a modifier struct, and this is going to allow us to implement some player ship modifiers. And then we'll implement an upgrade system so that the player can upgrade their ship as they collect currency. And the last thing we want to do is just create a UI element for these modifiers, and that way the player can see the progression as they use their currency. I do want to fix one thing in our game. One of the things that I want to take note of is as we're firing our weapon, we're creating these projectiles that go out into the world. And as we start to get more and more of these weapons, we're going to be creating hundreds or even thousands of these projectiles on the screen at any time. But currently those projectiles are just going out into infinity, and they're never getting destroyed unless they hit an enemy ship. Now, eventually, there's going to be so many of these in our game, the performance of our game will become very sluggish, and eventually it may even crash. And for this type of game, we want performance to be as high as possible and optimized. So what I'd like to do is set up a function in our projectile base that after a certain number of time, the projectile will destroy itself. So I'm going to create a new function in projectile base, and I'm going to call this self-destruct. Now, the projectile base is the parent class to all the projectiles we've made so far, which include the enemy projectile, which is going to be used in the bombs and maybe used in other enemies later on in our game. And in here, all I want to do is just say destroy actor. And this will be self. Now on begin play, I want to set a timer by function, and we'll just call self-destruct here. And for the time, this is how long we want it to be on the screen. Let's start with 1 second for now, but I actually want this to be a variable. So I'll drag off and promote to a variable. And essentially what this is how long the projectile is going to be on the screen, which you could also call the range. So I'm going to call this projectile range, or just range. And now you see that all the projectiles are only traveling a certain distance into the world. And this is even on our bombs. So for this bomb projectile, let's set the range a little bit farther. We'll go something like 5 seconds. And we can overwrite this on each projectile. So for instance, our rockets, we may also want to be a little bit longer. So now that that's set up, let's talk through how we're going to set up this struct for our player ship. What we want to do is we want to create a system that allows the player to upgrade their ship during the gameplay using the currency that they'll collect. Now, you can create any type of modifier that you want, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to equip 3 modifiers to my player ship. I'm going to use weapon range, fire rate, and a damage modifier. Now again, you could just customize these to whatever you want. So you can add one to do ship movement speed. You can allow the player to use currency to buy additional weapons. And once these are set up, you'll also have the ability to set up additional power-ups. So you could have a power-up that increases weapon range or fire rate for a short time or permanently. And at the bottom is how I'm going to set up mine to work. So modifier struct is actually going to be on player ship. And when we fire weapon, I want to pass that modifier into our weapon. And that's where some of the functionality will take place. For instance, fire rate will be modified at the weapon class, but damage and weapon range will be modified on the projectiles, because we want to have each projectile be able to handle its own range and damage. So once we create this modifier, we need to make sure that we're passing it through each of our classes correctly. And this will allow a lot more flexibility down the road and reduce the need to reprogram things once they've already been programmed. So let's start. I'm here back in my project, and I'm just going to create a new struct. And I just called this f_ship modifier. And I'm going to create 3 variables, and they're all going to be integers. And this will allow us to make sure that they can be incremented and decremented appropriately. So I'll call the first one weapon range. And then I'll add 2 more, and this is going to be fire rate and damage. And now on my weapon base, I just want to add a new variable for that modifier. And so we set that up on our weapon base, and now we want to set it up on our player ship. So let's add another new variable, and we'll call this modifiers ship modifier. So now we have it on our player ship, and we have it on our weapon base. We want this modifier to be passed into every weapon. If you remember, we have this start firing, which takes our active weapons, and then for each of those weapon classes that we have in active weapons, it'll call start firing on the interface that is here. This is where we can pass in our modifier struct into our weapons. On our start firing interface, we want to create an input into this, and this is going to be our modifiers. And let's just call this modifiers. Now when we go back to player ship, we'll be able to pass this in to our start firing function. And then on weapon base, we'll see that it is an input. So we can set this right after that. And this will mean as soon as we start firing, we're going to pass that through, set it to whatever the modifiers are on this weapon, and then we can use them on the weapon. And here we have this function called get fire rate, and this is where we are setting how quickly each weapon fires. We also want to pass a variable into this function so that we can modify this fire rate based upon those modifiers. Now, you could do this a couple different ways. You could either have the input to this be the struct and then break it out here, or you can just break it out on this side and take just the fire rate and pass it into this function. And that's the way I'm going to do it. And here's where we're going to use a little bit of math, and you have some flexibility based upon how you want this fire rate modifier to modify the fire rate of your weapon. So if you want it to double or 50% faster for each modifier point that's put into here, this may take some tweaking to try to figure out what's balanced and what's fair. But for right now, what I want to do is for every point that the player puts into this modifier, I want to increase it by 20%. So when there's 5 points invested, it'll double the fire rate. So to do that, we're going to need to make this a float. And then I want to multiply this by 0.2, and that would be equal to 20%. And so this will give us 20, 40, 80, and so on percentage. Now I want to add this to another number, and that's 1, and that would equal 100%. So when this is 0, the output of this node will be 1. When this is 5, the output of this node will be 2. And then I want to multiply this by my fire rate, and then the output of this multiplication will be what goes into the denominator of this divide node. And I'll walk through the math again real quick, just in case you didn't follow the first time. So we're going to take a modifier input, which could be any number. I'm going to clamp mine between 1 and 5. So if this is 1, we will get an input of 1. We'll multiply that by 0.2, which would give us 0.2. We'll add that to 1, which would give us 1.2, and then we're going to multiply that by the fire rate, which will give us an increased fire rate of 20%, which becomes the new denominator of 1, which means the weapon will fire 20% faster. Now, if my input here was 5, then we would get 5 times 0.2, which is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, which would be 200% of the fire rate. And the benefit of this is when it's 0, it actually just, the product of this is 0, which means we add 0 to 1, which means our fire rate is just 100%. And we're going to use similar logic to this for some of our other modifiers too. So I just want to make sure you understand the math and how we're doing it, because it's going to carry over to the other ones as well. So that takes care of the fire rate. Now the other two, we're going to need to pass into the projectile. So we also want to have this modifier on our projectile base as well. And here is where we're spawning those projectiles in weapon base. And this is the only time that we can pass in this modifier from the weapon to each projectile. So on our projectile base, I actually want to make this instance editable and expose on spawn. And one thing to note here is that here on my BP weapon base, I'm spawning an actor and I'm passing in this variable, which is called projectile class, which will then spawn the actor of whatever projectile is set up for each weapon. Now, one issue is that if this is not set to the projectile class, then we will not be able to pass in that variable. So it's really quick to fix. We just want to click here, type in projectile base or whatever you called your projectile base class and set that. And now when we refresh, that ship modifier will pop up, and that's because on our projectile base, we set this to expose on spawn and instance editable. And now we'll be able to pass this in from our weapon to the projectile as we're spawning the projectile. And again, this will just allow you to have much more flexibility in the way you set up your weapons, so you're only having to program things once. So if you change the modifier, then you only need to go back to each of those classes and just change the functionality on that class. So now that we've passed our modifier struct from our player ship to each weapon, and then from each weapon to each projectile that's being spawned, now we can have an effect on each of these projectiles. So let's start by creating a new function for calculating the projectile range. I'm just going to right click on this and type collapse to function. I'm going to call this calculate projectile range or calculate range. And this should be a pure function. And let's open that up. Now, same as how we did it back here on our weapon base, we can just copy all of this, go to our projectile and just paste it in. And the input to this will be weapon range. Now again, this down here would be a percentage, so in this case 20%. So we'll take that range modifier, multiply it by 0.2 to get a percentage, add it to 1 for 100%. Then we will pull our projectile range into here and multiply that number by projectile range to get a new percentage, and then pass that into the output of this function. And that means that whatever that new range value is will become the value of our timer. And the benefit of this is you can set each projectile to have their own range, and it will all be handled differently. Each one would be increased by that percentage. So you don't need to program it for each weapon. It's programmed now for every projectile that we ever create. And the last one that we want to handle is the damage, and that's down here. And again, we can just do the same thing. So collapse this to a function, call this calculate damage, make it a pure function, and then we'll just paste that in one more time. And that's set up as well. Now, the damage is the only one that I'm going to make a slight adjustment to. I want every time we put a point into damage, I want to increase this by 100%. So I'm just going to put a 1 here. And now if this is 1, this will be 100%, so 200%, 300, 400, and so on. So if you have 5 points invested into this, your bullets will be doing 5 times the damage. And again, because our base damage can be set independent on each weapon class, this will automatically adjust for every weapon or every projectile we ever create. And so the next step is for us to create an upgrade system. So something that allows the player to use the currency to upgrade their ship during gameplay. And we set up each of those 3 modifiers on our player's ship. Now I'm going to implement this using my number keys 1, 2, and 3. You can have it be a different type of system. And this is, again, where there's just a lot of flexibility to create your own system in your game. So you don't have to do things exactly the way that I'm doing. I'm just going to show you my implementation. But again, this is just giving you some foundation to build upon for your game. Most of our controls are being handled through the player camera. So I would like to set up these controls on my player camera. And the reason for that is because here is where we put our BP bank component that we created. So I'm gonna need to be able to access this component to see if the player has enough money and then make a withdrawal from their bank when they want to purchase an upgrade. So I think it's best to just implement all of this through the player camera directly. And so how the system is gonna work is on player camera, the player is gonna press one of these three buttons to purchase an upgrade. The bank is gonna see if it has enough money, and then if it does, it'll call the upgrade on the player ship, and then it's gonna collect the currency from the bank to pay for it. So let's go ahead and get started implementing this upgrade system. Now, just to get this implemented quickly, I'm just going to call each of these using the keyboard events. This is not really what I would recommend for a final implementation, but just to get this going, this is how I'm gonna do it. So I'm gonna set up each of these three keys. And let's start with the number 1 key. So for 1, I'm gonna have this set up the fire rate. So we can actually right click here and type fire rate, and that'll create a little comment on this node so that we remember what we're doing. If you want, we can just do the other 2. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get my BP bank, and I want to see what my current currency is. And if it's greater than or equal to a number, then we'll have a branch. And this is that first check. We want to see if we have enough money. So let's set it to something like 500 just for starters. And once we've done that check, we want to see if the player can actually be modified. And one thing to be aware of is that if the player's ship has been destroyed, we have a brief delay before we spawn a new ship. And if the player was to press this modifier button during that time, then it would fail to modify the ship. And we can just do is valid, or also you can just right click here and say convert to modified get. And now we'll get the player ship, and if it's valid, then we can call some functionality. And so this validated get is essentially the same thing as getting the variable and then validating it. So it's just one less thing on our node tree to keep it a little bit tidier. Now on the player ship, we want to call a function, and we currently don't have a function for this, so let's go and set it up. So I'm gonna create a new function, and I'm gonna call this increase fire rate modifier. And in here, I want to get this get modifiers. I'll break it out so we can get just the fire rate one. I want to have each of these modifiers be clamped to a certain value, and that will prevent the player from just investing infinite resources and just continually increasing the fire rate or increasing the damage until it's some astronomical number. What I want to do is pull this off and say if it's less than, and this is going to be that clamped value. So I'll just set it to 5. I want each of my modifiers to clamp at 5. Now you could do something different, but this is how I'm doing it for my game. So after I've checked to see that it's less than that clamped value, then I'll go ahead and actually do the modification. So I'll add one here. And then here I can drag off and say set members. And I can drop down here and set just fire rate. And now I can take this modifier struct and set just that one member of this struct, and the others will stay the same. And just to show that this is working, I'm going to do a print string and for testing, one thing I'm going to do is just set my bank to have a little bit more money in it. So I'll set it to 2,500. So now that this increase fire rate modifier function is set up, let's go ahead and call that here on our player camera. And we can see that when we press the 1 key, our modifier is going up until it reaches 5, and then it will stop. And the last thing is that we want the currency to go down when we purchase one of these modifiers. But here in this function, we won't know if we actually purchased it because there's a point where it could be clamped off. So we don't just want to blindly call the functionality to remove the currency from the bank. What we'd like is to have some check here on the output of this function that tells us whether it was purchased. So here in this function, what we can actually do is grab our return node and we'll add a Boolean here for was purchased. And if it was, then we want this to be true. And if it wasn't, which would be the output of this branch here for false, we'll leave that as false. And now back here, we have that was purchased having an output of a Boolean. So we can have another branch here that takes that as an input. And then we can set currency to minus a number. And that number would be the same number that we input here. So let's just drag this off and promote it to a variable. And it's going to be called fire rate modifier cost. And then that will also be the input to this, which is the input to this new set currency. So now as I'm purchasing those modifiers, the currency is going down. So that's working. And when we hit 0, it will no longer allow us to purchase additional upgrades. And we can check this by going down to 2000 or anything less than 2500. And we should stop at 4 now. And we can't purchase the 5th one because we're out of currency. And likewise, we can set it to 3000, which will allow us to buy 5, but then it won't allow us to buy that last one because we've reached the maximum number of upgrades for that modifier. So that first modifier has now been implemented, which means the rest should be pretty straightforward. And if you want, you can challenge yourself to just try to do the other two. And if you want to do that, go ahead and pause the video now. Otherwise, I'm going to show you how I would do it. And just as a quick hint, it should be pretty quick because most of this we can just copy and paste. They'll be relatively the same. There'll just be a couple of things that we need to set up. We need to set up a different cost for each of our modifiers, unless you want them all to be the same cost. But something like the damage modifier might be way more powerful, so we might want to make that one cost a little bit more to make the player have to invest more resources. Additionally, we're going to have to create a new function for each of those modifiers on our player ship, but those should be pretty straightforward. Again, you should be able to just duplicate the function. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. I'm going to increase the speed a little bit, but it won't increase it too fast to where you could still follow along if you need a little bit of help. All right, so hopefully you were able to follow along or even challenge yourself to do that without the help. Just for testing, I've increased my currency to 10,000, and this is going to allow me to purchase multiple upgrades of each type and see if all of these functions are working. And I set my damage to 1500, my range to 750, and my fire rate to 500. And this allows me just to check each one. So damage 2, range 2, fire rate 2. Let's get each of them to 3. So now I should not be able to buy the damage one because it's 1500. I was able to buy the range one, and now I can't buy any of them. So those are all working. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward for you. But I don't want to be using these debug messages. I would like the player to have some type of UI so they know how much of each one they've purchased. So this is going to be the last step of this video. I'm just going to create a quick UI for each of these modifiers so that the player can see how many they've purchased and how many they have left that they could purchase. So here I am in my UI folder, and there's a few different ways that you could do this. You could set it up directly on your HUD. And just for a quick implementation, this is probably the fastest way to do it. If you wanted to, you could set up a different widget for each of these and have it linked to the modifier. Having a different widget for each modifier could be useful if you wanted to have a system, say, where the player could swap out the modifiers, or selecting different ships gives access to different modifiers. So there's a lot of flexibility based upon how you want to make your game. But if you want a quick implementation, then you can just go ahead and put it directly on the HUD. I'm going to show how to set up a different widget for each modifier, but you don't have to do it this way. You can go ahead and just put it directly on your HUD. Most of the steps should be pretty much the same no matter which way you do it. So I'll start by creating a new BP widget, and let's start with the fire rate. I'm going to use a size box as my base, and this will allow it to automatically adjust the size based upon what's inside of it. Create a vertical box, and then I'm going to have 3 elements in this vertical box. I'll do 2 text elements and 1 progress bar. And let's just set this to desired. Scroll in real tight so we can see what it is. So this top one, I want it to be the number of credits that this upgrade costs. And for my fire rate modifier, that was 500 credits. And you can create like a currency system, so I'll use CR for credits. And then I want the player to know what this modifier is for. So I will type projectile range. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. And then for my progress bar, I want that to fill up as the player purchases upgrades. So I'll go ahead and create a binding for this. And we're going to need to be getting the variable from the player ship. So on my construct, I want to do get actor of class. Of player ship, and I'm going to promote this to a variable. Now again, I could do a validated get of this in this get percent function. This widget is going to be created when the game first starts, so this should work that first time. But as the player ship is destroyed, we're going to need to keep getting access to that player ship. So off the is valid, let's copy that again. And this may look a little bit weird, but this is the way that we're going to prevent bugs coming up on our game. There may be a cleaner implementation of this, but for now, this is good enough for me. So essentially, we're going to want to be getting the percentage so that we can fill this bar up. So we'll do a validated get, but if it's not valid, we want to get the player ship again and try to set it to that variable so that the next time it calls this, we have it. And then if it's not valid, which means the player ship is probably still destroyed, then we just won't return anything, which would mean that this function just ends, and that will be fine. So from player ship, let's get our modifier, and we'll break this out and get just that weapon range, change it to a float, and then we want to divide this by a number. So this will start at 0, and it can go all the way up to 5. And when it's 5, we want that to be that the bar is full, which would be 100%. So this denominator here should be 5. And that way we'll divide the number by 5. So if it's 0, this just returns 0. If it's 1, it'll return 0.2, which is 20%, all the way up to 100%. And the next thing we need to do is put this widget into our HUD. So in our HUD here, let's search for fire rate, and we can just drag that in, and I'll anchor it to the bottom middle. and I had a little bug, so just make sure it's actually set up to the modifier that we're going to be changing, which in this case is fire rate. And now when I press 1, we'll see that bar starts to fill up all the way up to full, which is at 100%. So now that that's set up, we can very easily just duplicate this and set up 2 more for the other 2 modifiers. And I realized I made another mistake. This is the fire rate modifier widget, so this should also say fire rate. And the last thing I did is in the size box, I did a width override to 200, and this is so that for each one, they'll all be the same size. So now that that's sorted out, let's actually set up this next one, which is for our range. And now both of those are set up. So the fire rate and the projectile range, and the last one is the damage. And now that these are all set up, let's just go ahead and test them. So when I hit 1, the first one should go up, 2, the second one, 3, the third one, and all of the numbers are showing correctly, and I can no longer purchase any of them. So that's all working correctly now. So I know this was a little bit of a long video. There was a lot to cover in here, but hopefully you learned a little bit about how we could set up this functionality and how we could pass it through each of those actors to get the information that we wanted from the struct and then continue to pass it through. And most of the core functions of our game have now been set up. In the next lesson, we're going to create a boss enemy that the player will have to defeat at the end of the level, which means we're going to set up an attack pattern for our boss, which will be the most advanced AI so far that we've set up. Now, it's not really advanced, but it should get you thinking about interesting ways to set up AI for the enemies in your game.